pleasure to once again welcome back Shulie, who needs no introduction. And really, this is, I guess it's a sad bonus course. As Shulie, we're planning to do her scheduled next session in January. You'll get details about that in the next coming weeks. But after the Zev Ehrlich, who was killed in Lebanon, and archaeologists went into Lebanon to sort of see what's going on. Shulie contacted me as I was in a taxi in Rome to say that she wanted to give a course in his memory on archaeologists in Israel. So that's what this 4-part series is, the various archaeologists. So it should be a zchut for his neshama, and a zchut that we should have peace in the land, and should be a good time, better times for our people. And want to thank Shulie, always interesting. And Bakasha, it's all yours. We can.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so while I'm sharing, just 2 very quick introductions. Well, 3 very quick introductions. Always more than one, right? First of all, thank you to everybody who reached out. I know a lot of people reached out to give me condolences on my father, and I really appreciate that very much. So as Rabbi Kelman mentioned, this course was born out of the very sad and untimely death of Zev Ehrlich of Jabo. We'll talk a little about him. And Torah and Moshe and Rabbi Kelman are always willing to give me time, and that's always nice. So just 2 dedications for this course. One is in the memory of Jabo, of Zev Ehrlich. Zev Ehrlich, for those who have not heard of him, he was not an archaeologist, but he was a researcher. He was a tour guide. He was somebody who knew the whole country back and forth, and was essentially fearless and just went places to discover and to find out more. And because he knew so much, and we'll talk a little about this maybe in our second class, knowing the land is very useful, not only for tour guides and historians, but also for the army. And he was really very connected to a lot of people in the army. He would come and he would speak to soldiers about where they were going on a very practical level. Be aware that there are underground caverns or tunnels or things here where terrorists could hide, stuff like that. And also on the level of, you should know what you're fighting for and you should know where you are. So he really researched everywhere, went everywhere. The fact that he went into Lebanon is in no way surprising, and I'm sure he had been many times before. And his insights, what I really liked about him, and I think many people liked about him, is that he knew a ton. He just knew everything, but he was able to teach in an incredibly clear way, and to get ideas across in a way that was just very simple. He wrote a weekly column for a long time for Makor Rishon, for one of the Hebrew newspapers here. And it was always connected somehow to the Haftorah. Right? And how can we think about the Nevi'im and where they were, right? The land and where they were walking on the land. And so many insights of his, I think, are just easy to understand and clear. I'll just give you one for now, because coming up Hanukkah, right? We know that the Hanukkah story is, we often think of it as just like the Maccabees come into the temple, they purify it, and it's over. No, it's actually a very, very long process. And there are 8 major battles. But what Jabo did, which is really very neat, is he said the coming to the Beit HaMikdash, coming to the temple, was in the middle between the first 4 battles and the second 4 battles. And that's a very nice idea, but it's so much of a nicer idea when you can do what he did, which is to draw a Chanukiah, right? To draw 8 candles, 4 before, 4 after, and the middle branch is coming to the Beit HaMikdash. So it's just that he really was a master teacher. So that's one person who we're going to dedicate this course to. The other person we're going to dedicate this course to is my father, who, as many of you know, passed away almost 2 months ago. My father was not an archaeologist. He was not a historian. He was a chemistry professor. He was a man of science. And he came to Israel to visit me and my family many times. And he really was very fascinated by Hebrew, by Bible, by archaeology. Not his field, but he always wanted to learn about it. So it's nice to be able to dedicate this in his memory as well. Okay, so what we're going to do today is we are going to look at the beginnings, at the foundations. Okay, so we call this course do I have a picture of the Chanukiah? Oh, maybe at the end, remind me. I should have it in my saved in my computer. Remind me, and I'll try to put it out there. Okay, so we're going to talk about the beginnings of archaeology. Archaeology is a new science. It really, anything that happens before is really treasure hunting, right? We hear about people going to various places and looking for spoils, but the science of archaeology, which is what some people would call soft science, right? It's very hard. Things change all the time. But we have an amazing development of it in the 19th century, okay? And that's really what we're going to be looking at. The attempt to really understand the past as opposed to making up stories, right? Tour guides made up a lot of stories. We're even, guilty of that a little bit today, but we try not to do it too much. So trying to understand the past through using tools, all different kinds of tools, and also learning the land of Israel. Okay, so that's really what we're going to be looking at, those two attempts. This is, of course, a picture of excavations in what are today called the Western Wall tunnels, the Kotel tunnels. We're going to talk about two Charleses, Wilson and Warren, both of whom are involved there, but the artists also are amazing, right? In the drawings. And of course, they're working. I love how you can see here the little details. They're working by torchlight, right? Torches, as in not flashlights, but actual torches, right? And without any of the technology that archaeologists have today, and finding unbelievable things. So we will continue on with that. Okay, a basic timeline. We are not going to be going through all these times, but it's helpful just to get an idea. We're going to talk a lot about the 19th century, mid to late 19th century, and a little bit in the 20th century. But we do want to talk first about a very interesting character named Historia Parchi, who kind of intuits a lot of archaeology before archaeology happens. So he's in the 14th century. He's centuries before anything else we're going to talk about. But we're going to leap forward after him to the 19th century. And you can see by looking very, quickly at this list here that pretty much everybody here is not Jewish, right? This is the era of archaeologists who are Christians, who are largely devout Christians, knowledgeable in the Bible, and they want to come and they want to see what is the land of the Bible, but not only just, like we said, to hear the Bubamaises, but to see the real things, okay? A lot of British, but not only. Okay, the first ones are actually Americans, Edward Robinson and Eli Smith, Conrad Schick, Swiss German. Okay, Barclay is an American. Tristram is British also. Okay, so we're going to see a lot of British after that. One of the important milestones here is that in the middle, smack in the middle of the 19th century, we have the Crimean War. Okay, which if you grew up in Europe or in England, you know a lot about. If you're American, chances are not so good that you know so much about it. Okay, but it was a very, very important war, and it was a war where the Ottoman Empire was basically bailed out by the European powers, right? We won't talk about what happened in Europe, but what happened here in the land of Israel, the Ottoman Empire got a lot of help from the European powers, and in return, they had to give some pluses, some perks to the European powers. Those are called the capitulations. And whereas before 1856, the Ottoman Empire basically did whatever they wanted and no foreign citizens had too much in the way of rights, after 1856, there's a little more wiggle room for people who are coming. The Ottomans are still very, very suspicious of archaeologists. They don't allow them to do very much, but there's a little bit more of an opening. And that's part of the story of being able to have all these things like the Palestine Exploration Fund. Okay. Wilson, Warren. We're going to talk about John McGregor, who's less well known, and his canoe, Rob Roy. Okay? We're also going to see some frauds, Shapira, Parker, okay? Very interesting, and William Flinders Petrie, who kind of stands alone. He's going to be towards the end of our story. Okay, so just to get a little bit of an idea of the timeline, right, of what we're talking about. Okay, the question we want to ask, right? There's archaeology all over the place. Anybody who's ever been to the British Museum or the Louvre, right, and seen the treasures that have come from Greece, right, or have come from Assyria. If you've been to the Metropolitan Museum, I just tried to go there last time I was in New York to see those amazing Assyrian five-legged horses. It's now closed, right? But there are all these things that people discovered and schlepped back to their host countries, by the way, plundering them from their host countries. Egypt, of course, so much in Egypt, but on a scientific level, you had the greatest flowering of science, not of the treasures, but of science in the land of Israel under the Ottoman Empire and then under the British Mandate. Why? Okay, so a few things. First of all, the Ottoman Empire, as everybody knows by the end of the 19th century, is falling apart. And all of the European powers want to get in there, right? Everybody wants a piece. They all want to compete. So they come here and they build buildings. This is why we have this nice picture of one of the churches in the Russian compound here. Everybody comes to Jerusalem and builds something major here. But it's not only that. They come here and they want to lay a claim. They want to have a stake here. Archaeology is part of that stake. Okay, Simon Sebag Montefiore in his book on Jerusalem, he says it's empire building by other means. We come here, we send our researchers here, and we bring some stuff back home, right? So we are laying a claim to this place. Religion is also very important, right? We have here our King James Bible, right? Millennialism, the idea of the second coming of Jesus. There's a lot of interest in the Bible. There's a lot of groups, particularly Protestants, who are coming to the land of Israel to missionize, both among the Muslims and particularly among the Jews, right? Because there's this belief that Jesus will return if we can, missionize and get the Jews to come to Christianity. Okay? So this is an idea that we have to find out more about the Bible. We have to lay our stakes here in the land of Israel. You also have, we get to the Victorian era, in the middle of the 19th century, you have a lot of romanticizing of the past. You want to go back to those glory days. Okay, so those are all kind of these larger thematic ideas. You also have a lot of practical things, right? Jerusalem is a good place to work. It's an easier place to work than Nineveh or Egypt. You have a lot of transportation. You have modern communications. You have rights for non-Muslims. Okay? It's also the beginning of photography. Photography is important. Sketching is also important, but photography is important. And one of the things that's very interesting, and it's a real paradox, is that unlike in Nineveh, right, or in Luxor, where you're going to find these amazing treasures, the land of Israel, it's not as amazing, right? We have a lot of stuff that's really cool, but it's not as impressive as finding the reliefs, the Lachish reliefs in Nineveh. And sort of paradoxically, that means you are better at the methodology and the discipline. You're not treasure hunting. You're working very hard to find the layers and the remains and the pottery. Okay, so all of this kind of contributes to create this perfect storm in the land of Israel in the 19th century. But we're going to step back for a minute just because I love Eshtoria Barclay and we have to talk about him for a minute. So other people before the 19th century obviously have wanted to understand the land, have wanted to understand geography, whether it's Jews like Rashi and Radak, who, though they never come to the land of Israel, they live in Europe, they still have a deep understanding as much as they can of where things are, and they want to know the locations, and they want to be able to explain where the story is based on geography. You also have Christian scholars Okay, somebody like Eusebius, right, bishop in Caesarea, writes a book called the Onomasticon, which is the geography of the land of Israel. All the places in the Bible, where are they? Okay, so you always had people who were interested in this. One of the most sophisticated is a fellow named Eshtori Haparchi. Eshtori Ish Tours. He's a man of tours. Okay, he comes from Provence. If you look at his dates here, right, is the end of the 13th, the middle of the 4th to the middle of the 14th century. He's living in a time of great upheaval. In Western Europe, Jews are being kicked out, and he writes in the introduction to his book, Kaftor Vaperach, right? He's Eshtori Haparchi, so he writes a book called Kaftor Vaperach, based on the decorations on the menorah. And he writes in the introduction how he's Navanad, he's a wanderer. He had to leave his home because of persecution, because Jews are being expelled, and he makes his way eventually to the land of Israel. He goes to Jerusalem, but there's too much trouble there. The Maimonidean controversy is going on. Everybody's fighting. He says, I don't want to live in Jerusalem. I'm going to pick up and I'm going to go somewhere that's just the most beautiful, wonderful place in the land of Israel. And he guesses Beit Sha'an. Okay, Beit Sha'an, really? Yes, that's where he wants to go. Okay, he goes to Beit Sha'an and he sets as his goal to study the geography of Tanakh. Right? And he actually goes and he travels to these places and he writes in his introduction. It's not that I'm smarter than anybody else, but I put in the mileage, right? I didn't just talk the talk. I walked the walk. I went, I saw these places, and now I can knowledgeably write about them. And he does a few things that it takes other scholars literally centuries to figure out. The picture here on the right, is a picture of the Tell of Megiddo. Megiddo, super important city, around for 4,000 years, goes back to the early Bronze Age, and it's a Canaanite city, and then it's an Israelite city, and then Hellenistic time, 4th century before the Common Era, that's it. Megiddo loses it just vanishes. We don't hear about it anymore. There's a town nearby in Roman times called Legio, but Megiddo kind of falls off the map. Eshtori Haparchi figures out where Megiddo is. And it's only in the end of the 19th century that we go and excavate it. But he knew already in the 14th century where it was. The other thing he figured out, and this again takes centuries before people understand this again, they lose this idea, is he says, you know what? If we have a place in the north that is not so far from Tiberia, and it's called by the Arabs Safuria, okay? It's like a half-hour drive from Tiberia, a half a day's walk. We know there's a town that the Mishnah and the Gemara talks about called Sipori, right? If you have Safuria, it sounds a lot like Sipori. It's in the right place. We can trust that the Arabs held on to that name, okay? Arabs come into the land of Israel in the 7th century. In most cases, unless they have a good reason, they hold on to the names from Tanakh and from the time of the Mishnah. And if it works, if it sounds right, chances are good that this is the real place. And this is an idea that Eshtori Haparchi is the first one who talks about it. Our next guy, Edward Robinson, hundreds of years later, he is going to come back. He doesn't come back. He thinks he discovered it by himself. And he suggests this idea. Okay, so we're going to jump forward in history. Robinson, right, one of our first guys, he's a Bible scholar. He's a professor at Union Theological Seminary. Okay, and already in 1838, he travels to the land of Israel with someone else named Eli Smith, a Protestant missionary and a scholar, and they try to figure out where are the places in the Bible. Okay, and then they go home and they publish this book, Biblical Researches in Palestine, Mount Sinai, and Arabia Petraea. Okay, now, first of all, realize the conditions are extremely primitive. Okay, but he really figures out this idea. He talks about going through the land of Binyamin, okay, north of Jerusalem, and passing through places called Anata and Geba and Muchmas. Okay, and he understands that this is Anatot and Giv'ah or Geva or Givat Shaul, right, or Michmas, places that we have in Sefer Shmuel and Sefer Yirmiyahu, and he understands that connection. Now, the fact that he's coming from New England and he's a Bible scholar is very much part of the story. And in his introduction to the book, he writes this, and it's really very beautiful, and it makes a lot of sense, right? This deep connection of America, particularly American, although not only, Protestants, Bible readers to the places of the Bible, right? And what does he say? My first motive had been simply the gratification of personal feelings. As is the case of most of my countrymen, especially in New England, the scenes of the Bible had made a deep impression upon my mind from earliest childhood. And afterwards, in riper years, this feeling had grown into a strong desire to visit in person the places so remarkable in the history of the human race. Whoever is scribbling all over, please stop scribbling. In New England, as the child grows up, the names of Sinai, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, the Promised Land become associated with his earliest recollections and holiest feelings, right? And it's not only, by the way, that they read the Bible stories, right? If you've traveled around anywhere in America, and particularly in New England, you know that you will come upon towns called Shiloh, right? Called Rehoboth, called Bethlehem, right? This legacy of the Bible is very, very important. So that's what he's coming and trying to understand and to discover. Mostly the reason we remember Robinson is not because of his Tanakh connections, but because he's the first one who figures out what this weird protrusion is. Okay, so we have a drawing here from the early-ish part of the 19th century, mid-19th century, where you can see this wall, which it's hard to understand that what this is part of the Western Wall, right? Meaning if you went past these buildings here, you would get to the Kotel, you would get to where you daven. This today is what you can see on the bottom is the excavations that we can go to today, where you can visit the street, right, from the time of Beit Sheni. This is what we call the Southern Wall excavations. It's actually the Western Wall. It's the southern part of the Western Wall. But at that time, it wasn't excavated. And the dirt was built up all the way to this strange protrusion here, which essentially looks like a bench with a nice little shady spot, right? And nobody really gave it a second thought until Robinson came along and he looked at it and he said, this is not a bench. This is part of an arch. Now, he understood it as part of an arch of a large bridge that reached across all the way from the area of the Temple Mount to the area of the upper city, what we call the Jewish Quarter today. After the excavations that were done here in the 1990s, right? You could see the picture down here on the right, right? Today, the arch is high up in the air and the street is many feet below. Today, we understand that it wasn't part of a bridge, but it was, well, it was basically a pedestrian bridge, right? Here's Robinson's Arch, which, by the way, why doesn't it exist anymore? Because when the Romans destroyed the Beit HaMikdash, this is from Second Temple times, the Romans destroyed the Beit HaMikdash, they pull out the keystone of the arch and the whole thing comes crashing down, okay? But in the time of the Second Temple, this is part of this monumental pedestrian bridge where you would do your shopping on the street here, okay? There were stores here. You would finish your shopping, and this was one of your entryways up onto the Temple Mount. And Robinson is really the first one who figures this out. So he comes with the intention of finding the land of the Bible, but really he finds Beit Sheni, Second Temple stuff as well. And this is really how his name got carried on. Today we call it Robinson's Arch, okay? Okay, our next guy, very, very interesting person who made his mark mostly in Jerusalem. This is someone named Conrad Schick. And Conrad Schick is a fascinating guy. He's born in Germany, Protestant family, farming family, but he's kind of sickly. So they send him off to school and he trains to become a missionary. Okay. And as a young man, 1846, he's only 24 years old, he comes to Jerusalem. Now, he comes as a missionary, but obviously you don't make your living as a missionary. And this is why I wrote this strange title here. He gets a profession when he studies in Switzerland to become a missionary. On the side, he's going to fix cuckoo clocks You can imagine that being a cuckoo clock fixer in Jerusalem of the 19th century, you're not going to make such a good living. Now he comes to Jerusalem. He stays a religious Christian his whole life. He basically joins the organization of British Protestants, also the Germans who are here, but he stops being a missionary pretty soon. And he really falls in love with Jerusalem. He lives in Jerusalem for the rest of his life. He's in Jerusalem for 55 years, which is a really significant amount of time. And he's a brilliant man. He's an autodidact. He teaches himself architecture, and he teaches himself urban planning, and he teaches himself archaeology, and he's just fascinated by everything. So he makes a living as an architect and an urban planner. Okay? He plans the neighborhood of Mea Shearim, among others, right? Mea Shearim, you're not going to see too many big signs trumpeting that Conrad Schick, this devout Protestant, built Mea Shearim, but he did. Okay? He built very important buildings. This one on the right here, some of us Jerusalem people might recognize the clock and the sign here. It says Talita Kumi. Okay, that's all that's left of this very impressive building. Today, if you go on King George Street, right outside what used to be the Mashpir, right, we're all dating ourselves when we talk about these places. Okay, you could see by the bus stop, there's a little park that has the sign and the clock, and that's all that was left of this historic building that was demolished in the name of progress in the 60s, 70s. Okay, so that's how he made his living. But he was also fascinated by archaeology, and anything that was discovered in and around Jerusalem, he goes to check it out, and usually he writes about it, mostly in German, which is why he's not as well known as he should be. But he really has a huge impact on Jerusalem. This is another house that he was the architect of, and this one is still standing. And today it's actually had a very interesting revitalization. This is called Hansen House. It's on the edge of the neighborhood of Talbia. It started life as a hospital for lepers, for people who suffered from Hansen's disease. You could see on top there's an inscription, Jesus Hilfe, Jesus should help. It remains a hospital up until like the early 2000s. Today, it's actually a really interesting art center, and it's been restored, and it's used by artists, and there's a cafe there, and it's a really cool place. So he built a lot of different buildings. But he also was involved in many discoveries. So, for example, when there's a kid who goes into kind of exploring under the Gihon Spring, and goes into Hezekiah's tunnel, right, in the city of David, and discovers this inscription in ancient Hebrew, okay, what we today call the Shiloh inscription. It tells us how the tunnel was built in fertile times. Who do they call in to look at it and to understand it? Conrad Schick. He's your guy, right? And this is extraordinarily important discovery. When they discover ancient tombs north of Shar Shechem, that originally are thought to be Second Temple tombs, and some people think this is the tomb of Jesus. It's called the Garden Tomb. Today we know it's First Temple. Who do they go to? Conrad Schick. He's your guy, right? So anything that's happening in Jerusalem, he's finding out about it. And he gets amazing access, because another thing that he teaches himself to do, and that was actually pretty profitable in the 19th century. 19th century, they're very big on models. They love models, models of cities, models of houses, models of whole areas. So he built some models. He built a model of what the Temple Mount looked like in Second Temple times. He built a model of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and he got access to the Temple Mount to build a model of the Temple Mount and everything that's underneath it, which is very unusual because Muslims, the Ottoman Turks, very zealously guarded access to the Temple Mount. They didn't want anybody messing around going underground, and he managed to get in and to map it out. But also, these models made him a nice amount of money. And with that money, he builds his dream house, which you can still see today. If you walk along Rehov HaNevi'im, you can see this beautiful house called Beit Tavor, which has all kinds of very interesting architectural elements, like this little gatehouse here, which has a place like in medieval battlements where you could pour out boiling oil on the invaders. I'm not saying Conrad Schick ever did that, but he added in that architectural element. If you look at the corners of the house, actually, this is probably my favorite detail. You can only see it a little bit in this picture. The corners, all four corners have these little kind of protrusions. This is meant to be the corner, like the corners of an altar, like the corners of a mizbeach. And if you go into this house, you can see copies of all different kinds of archaeological artifacts. It's a very, very interesting place. He lived there for not very long. He built it and then he died not so long afterwards, and it was neglected for a long time. And then after World War II, had a very interesting later history. A Swedish nurse named Greta Andron, who had helped save Jews during the Holocaust. She came to Jerusalem. She worked as a nurse for the Street of the Prophets. Rehov HaNevi'im had many, many doctors. She worked as a nurse for one of the doctors there. And in her course of going to work, she would notice this house and she found it fascinating. And she learned about Conrad Schick. And she said, here's this guy who connected so many different elements of Jerusalem's history and Jerusalem's people. We should use this house as a place for non-Jews to come and to learn about the land of Israel and to learn about Jerusalem. And she goes back home to Sweden. She actually convinces the Swedish government to buy the house. And today it's a place called the Swedish Theological Institute, and it hosts all kinds of exchange students and interfaith stuff, and it's a very interesting place. So that's Conrad Schick, who's a very cool guy. Okay, moving on, we've got another American. This is a fellow named Dr. James T. Barclay. He's an actual doctor, okay? And he's also a missionary, because so many of these guys are missionaries. He comes to Jerusalem in 1851, ostensibly to treat people for malaria, but he's very interested in the Bible, and he does a lot of exploring, and he's probably most famous for discovering a cave that had been known for a long time and then kind of got lost. What do I mean? Okay, so if you read in the Mishnah, in the Gemara, you can read about a huge cave on the outskirts of Jerusalem called Me'arat Tzidkiyahu, Zedekiah's cave. And the Gemara talks about it. It's a huge thing. They talk about it in the context of carrying on Shabbat, right? Any cave, even a cave that's as big as Me'arat Tzidkiyahu, you can carry in it on Shabbat. And people knew about it, but as time passed, the opening to it got closed off. People got confused. Even today, people get confused. Tzidkiyahu, Chizkiyahu, which one do you mean? What are you talking about? And it sort of got lost. One day, Barclay was walking near Damascus Gate, near Shar Shechem, with his dog. It was after a heavy rain, and his dog disappeared. I didn't understand what happened. He's calling the dog, he's calling the dog. He hears the dog barking, and he starts to follow it, and he realizes the dog has slipped into a hole. And he follows the dog underground, and he sees it's the opening to a massive cave. Now, the Ottomans do not like people tunneling under things. They're very worried. They're very nervous about spies. So he has to come back at night with a torch and a rope, and he goes and he explores, and he rediscovers this cave. Okay? Later on, got these dapper-looking fellows over here in the cave today. This is an amazing cave. Come to Jerusalem. It is really cool to explore. It's now well lit and pathways and whatever. It's a quarry, okay, that was essentially dug out by Herod by Cheney in Second Temple times. It has absolutely nothing to do with Zedekiah, with Tzidkiyahu, except for the name and some legends, but it's an amazing place. And these guys are part of an organization that still exists today called the Freemasons Society. Now, the Freemasons used Tzidkiyahu's cave as their meeting headquarters. Why? Because they said, wow, this is an amazing quarry. Clearly a great builder built it. Who's the greatest builder of all? And also happens to be the patron saint of the Freemasons, King Solomon. So this is King Solomon's quarries, and they would hold their meetings here, okay? Not King Solomon, not King Zedekiah, King Herod, but still it's a great place. And Barclay is the discoverer. Okay, so far we've had very intrepid explorers. We've had kind of the beginnings of a scientific approach, an archaeological approach, but now we're going to really go heavily into a scientific survey. Okay? And the British are very good at these sorts of things. Okay, the British already in the late 1850s, early 1860s, they do what's called an ordnance survey. Okay, we're going to talk about it in a minute with Charles Wilson. Okay, they come to survey the city of Jerusalem. It's the first time you have an actual scientific, geographically accurate map of the city. Okay? And they're so excited by this that in 1865, they found something called the Palestine Exploration Society, okay, whose goals are to study the land of Israel. Ostensibly, they are not religious, but there's a lot of emphasis on studying the Bible and finding the Bible. These are all non-Jews, by the way. These are all Christians, mostly. I don't know if all. Okay, and they want to come and they want to do a survey, not just of Jerusalem, but of all of Palestine, right? Obviously, Palestine, nothing to do with Palestinians, right? Palestine is the name of the land in those times. And they come and they do a survey here and there around the country. You can find their surveyor's marks, right? So one of the really nice ones is in this picture over here. This is a rock down by the Dead Sea, okay? And you can see up high on the rock, it says PEF, Palestine Exploration Fund. Okay, what is this? They wanted to mark the high water marks of this Dead Sea. Today, this is across the road. It's all the way up the cliff, but the Dead Sea had times when it grew and when it waned. Okay, today it's only shrinking, but there were times where this would have been the high water mark, and that's what the PEF marks in the 1860s. This is the high water mark on the Dead Sea. Okay, they have an incredibly important collection of photographs, of maps, of manuscripts, right? They work very hard to really create a scientific foundation for later explorers, and it proves to be extremely useful for later explorers. So the precursor to this is what's called the Ordnance Survey. Okay? The idea is to have this accurate map of Jerusalem and to find new water sources. You know, the British are very good at maps. They send this fellow, whose name is Charles Wilson. Okay, it gets a little confusing. We've got a lot of Charleses. Okay, but Charles Wilson is sent to do this ordnance survey in the land of Israel. They don't find any new water sources, but like we said, they produce this very accurate map of Jerusalem. This is not a picture of Charles Wilson in the heat of a Jerusalem summer. Before he comes to Palestine, he went out to survey in the western United States, and he maps out the area between the Rocky Mountains and the Pacific. So this is a little bit more of like a Daniel Boone look. Okay? But in 1864, he comes to work on this survey, and in 1867, he returns under the auspices of the Palestine Exploration Fund, and he excavates near the Temple Mount. Okay, today we would call this the Western Wall tunnels, the coastal tunnels, and he finds the arch that eventually is named for him, Wilson's Arch. We'll see that in a minute. Okay. Long after he finishes his adventures here, okay, he goes home. He's already somewhat older, and he edits a travelogue series called Picturesque Palestine, okay, with artists Henry Fenn and J.D. Woodward. And this was, people didn't have the internet, okay? People didn't even take a lot of pictures because you didn't have a camera. So even if you were lucky enough to come on a trip, you didn't come home with your own pictures. You came home with a souvenir book that you could remember your travels. So this was definitely a big idea in the 19th, early 20th century. Wilson is immortalized in Wilson's Arch. Okay, Wilson's Arch, which today you can see when you go visit the Kotel tunnels. You can also see it even if you don't go to the Kotel tunnels, but you go to the inside section of the Western Wall, right? The men's and the women's section is right up here, right? This is a piece of this arch. Basically what it is, it's just a series of arches that were a bridge. Robinson thought the arch that he found was a bridge. Today we know it's just a pedestrian bridge. Wilson's Arch really was an entire bridge that went from the Temple Mount across to the upper city to the Western Hill, what the Jewish quarter is today. Okay? An aqueduct ran on it, and it was also a pedestrian bridge. And he's the first one to discover it. Even today, if you've been in the Kotel tunnels recently, I actually was just there today. I haven't been there in a while. Even today, the Kotel tunnels is very narrow, and you have to find your way. Imagine going to excavate it when there was absolutely nothing that was excavated, and the Ottoman Turks didn't allow you to do big open excavations. Everything was just shafts, small areas, and yet Wilson manages to find this. He also manages to explore under the Dome of the Rock. Again, not so easy, but he manages to get down there, and he finds a cave under the Dome of the Rock. That's what you're seeing in the pictures here. And new excavations in the Kotel tunnels have discovered that underneath this bridge, underneath the arches of this bridge, the Romans later came and built a theater, right? Go on the Great Bridge tour in the Kotel tunnels next time you're in Israel. Very worthwhile. Okay, Captain Warren. He's great. We love Captain Warren. Okay, like all these guys, right? They're all captains. They're all military men. He's involved in the engineering corps in the British Army, and that's why he's brought here, heading up another one of these PEF expeditions in 1867. Very young. These guys are very young. Okay, he's in his 20s. Again, he comes here looking for water sources, which he doesn't find. The Turks do not like this. The Ottoman Turks are always worried that people are trying to spy on them, that people are trying to tunnel underneath their buildings. They're very suspicious of anybody who claims to be an archaeologist, sometimes with good cause. We'll see our last person who really was trying to find treasure. But this guy was a real archaeologist, but the Turks are very suspicious of him, and that's why Warren, the famous thing about Warren is Warren's shaft. He can only dig these shafts, these long, deep and narrow excavations. Okay, we only get a small piece of the picture, but it's still something very important. He's a real adventurer. He's a Zionist, as we'll see in a minute from some of his writings. He writes a book called Underground Jerusalem. As you can see, the preface here, right? Complete account of our researches in Jerusalem, again, under the auspices of the PEF. The PEF gives him some money, but not as much money as he needs. So fortunately for him, he happens to be a very good fundraiser. And he writes about how he would host people. Just like today, people are fascinated by the Kotel tunnels. They were fascinated by Warren's tunnels as well. And he writes about how he'd host all these different groups, and fancy ladies would come and lift up their petticoats and go down ladders. And they were very into it. And he's fine with hosting them because what does it mean? He can hit them up for money to continue his excavations. Now, the thing that he's most famous for is what we call today Warren's Shaft, which is a little ironic that he's most famous for it because today our researches in the city of David kind of undermine a lot of what he said, but it's still very important. He excavates in the city of David, and he knows that there is the water source of the city of Jerusalem, the Gihon Spring, and he's curious. The Gihon Spring is all the way down at the bottom of the hill. Was there any kind of way to get to the water without being exposed, without having to go outside the walls? And essentially, he discovers an underground passageway, okay, that leads to what we call the shaft, right? This opening in the ground where, according to Warren and according to all archaeologists up until the 1990s, right, the girls of Jerusalem would go down this kind of a steep hill, dump their buckets down the shaft, get their water, come back. This is not a class on the city of David, so we're not going to go into what he got wrong. Suffice it to say, he got part of it wrong. There was a secret passageway, but the shaft was not really part of it, but it still helped us to understand the water system of Jerusalem in Canaanite times and later on after King David conquers the city. But he also explores, like we said, in the area of what today is the Kotel tunnels, which is completely, there's nothing, there's no excavation that's there. He goes down, he pokes around. At some point, he realizes that there's water and he has to find pieces of wood so that he doesn't drown. And he kind of sails on these doors that he finds, and he ends up in a pool at the end. He's not quite sure what to do, but he figures out a way to get out of there, to get up to the surface level. Only what does he discover when he gets out? That he's actually inside a convent. He's inside the convent, which today on the Via Dolorosa is called the Sisters of Zion. The sisters, as you can imagine, are none too pleased, right, when Captain Warren shows up in the middle of the convent. And because of that, today, this pool, which is called the Struthian Pool. You can see it if you go in the Kotel Tunnels tour. You get to the end and it's only half a pool because the other half is under the convent, and the sisters put a wall so that nobody could do what Captain Warren did. But he really was an amazing adventurer doing things against all odds. And unlike a lot of these other guys, some of them did like us, but he really is a proto-Zionist, right? This is the very beginnings of Zionism. And he really has a belief that the Jewish people can have a state, which was pretty uncommon in those days. So I brought you this passage here on the left, which is a great passage, right? He hosts all these people in the tunnels, and some of them are rabbis who are fascinated because he's digging very close to Har HaBayit, right? So he meets a lot of Jews. He says there is an irrepressible pride and presumption about this fragile, wayward people. Dressed in greasy rags, they stalk about the holy city with as much dignity as though they were dressed in the richest garments, and give way to no one. Years of oppression have in no way quelled their ancient spirit, and if they could only be induced to work, that's a great line, and become united, also still a problem, they would be a very formidable race, for their courage and fortitude makes up for the want of stamina. And he talks about how the land is able to absorb 15 million inhabitants. Realize that the British, who come along decades later, don't think that the land can hold more than 2 or 3 million people. He believes that the Jews can have their own state. The other passage here just gives you a little sense of him as somewhat of an eccentric person. I was on the receipt of this telegram, right? He gets a telegram that he's going to get his funding that he needs, right? So inspired that by the time I had reached the southeast angle of the temple area, I felt an irresistible inclination to celebrate this turning point in the state of affairs by standing on my head. These men had been passing by, and being curious about my singular movements, had watched me. They stopped in a line and gave me the deepest salam. There was no mistaking the construction they put upon this act. To them, I had been performing a religious ceremony, unlike the ordinary Christian forms, and not so different from their own, except that the Moslem stood on his feet, facing towards Mecca, and the Frank, right, the European, stood on his head. Whether it was a sign of madness, foolishness, or holiness was to them an indifferent matter. So Underground Jerusalem, Charles Warren, he's a lot of fun to take with you on a trip. Now, part of the story here, right, is, like we said, photography is just beginning. Some of these guys can afford photographers, but not all of them can. And they bring sketch artists, which you say to yourself, isn't an artist more expensive than a camera? No, right? Camera is very rare, it's very expensive. You have to have a guy who knows how to use a camera, right? So they bring sketch artists, and we have some of these great drawings, right? And this is an artist called William Stimson, and he came along on Warren's expedition. Okay, this picture here on the left is the exit from Warren's Shaft, and anyone who's been in Warren's Shaft in Ir David, it looks a little bit nicer. The steps are a little nicer, but it pretty much captures what it looks like. This is another great one. This is below Robinson's Arch. Just gives you a sense of like these guys, like, look what they're doing. They're going with their candles. They don't know if the whole thing's going to cave in on them. This, by the way, is a great picture because Warren had an assistant, a trusty assistant named Sergeant Birtles. And this is a drawing of Sergeant Birtles, who would go down to these crazy places on rope ladders and, not knowing what the future would hold. Okay, this brings us to something that we're going to talk about more in a later class, and this is the natural life of the land of Israel. Another one of these PEF founders. He's a minister. His name is Henry Baker Tristram. And he is less interested in archaeology, but he is fascinated by the natural life of the land of Israel. And in 1863, he takes a large trip throughout the land and also amazing drawings. He collects animals and brings them back to England, obviously not alive, right? These are taxidermied animals. Today we don't like this so much, but he actually preserved a world that would have vanished, right? Hunters would have hunted all these animals. There was no idea of nature preservation. So we have these great pictures, ibex over here, a pelican over here, these just stunning pictures. Right? Hyrax, if you've ever gone to Engedi, right? You have Hyraxes here. He spent a lot of time in Masada. This is his sketch of Masada, obviously pre-excavation. And if you ever go to Masada, or pretty much anywhere near there, you'll see these very, very friendly, cute little birds that have the brown over here on their wings. And he's the first one who wrote about them, so they got named for him. They're called Tristram starlings, or in Hebrew, they're Tristramit, right? He had other things named after him too, but this is the main one. So he has a beautiful emphasis on nature. This guy is less well known and very interesting. This guy is John McGregor. He is a Scot, and he's fascinated by canoeing. And he designs a canoe that's inspired by Indians. And in 1868, he explores the Jordan from the source waters of the Jordan, meaning all the way up in the north, the Dan, the Banyas, the Sneer. Okay? He goes down through the Chula Valley, which had not been drained yet, right? It's a big lake. And then he goes across land and he hooks up again to the Kishon River and out to the Mediterranean. And this is something that nobody had surveyed before. And he does it. Along the way, he meets some locals. At some point, they steal his canoe. He gets it back. Hey, he names the canoe. It's called the Rob Roy. And eventually, after he does this whole expedition, he gives the canoe to a sailing club in London on the Thames River. In 1982, two Israelis find out about it. They get it lent to the Israel Museum, not the Israel Museum, the Eretz Yisrael Museum in Tel Aviv. They copy it, and today the original is back in London, but we have a copy of it in a sailing club in Tel Aviv. So that's John McGregor and his Rob Roy. Okay, we have going to finish up quickly. Why? Because we still have questions. Okay, these guys exploring very virgin territory. The Golan, right? The Golan, pretty wild, not really very settled. Real exploration, archaeological exploration of the Golan really has to wait till after the 6-Day War. But these guys, Lawrence Oliphant, he's the one with the fabulous beard, Gottlieb Schumacher, they do a survey of the Galil, of the Galilee, and of the Golan. They write about ancient synagogues, Arbel, Kfar Nahum, which only later do people come back and really fully explore, but they're the first ones who really find out about them. Okay, we have been talking a lot about Protestants, Bible guys, missionaries. These are also Bible guys, but these are Catholics. Okay, the Dominicans, of course, are great, important Bible scholars. They come to Jerusalem and they build a very impressive church and building called Saint Etienne, monastery and a church. Just north of Shar Shem, of Damascus Gate, on Derech Shem, and they found a place called the École Biblique, right, the Bible Studies Institute, which still exists today and has a very important library, and they also get involved in archaeology. Now, they build this structure of Saint Etienne, and then they dig a crypt. on their grounds where they can bury the fathers who lived there and who died. But unbeknownst to them, they actually build this crypt above a very, very ancient burial chamber, which they then discover. They are sure that it's a second temple burial cave. And then two Jewish researchers, Gabi Barclay and Amos Kloner, right? They're very young guys, 1973. They're soldiers. They have a leave after the Yom Kippur War, or right before the Yom Kippur War. They go and they get permission to go and explore this cave, and they prove that it's actually a First Temple period burial cave, Jewish burial cave, which is really amazing. It's like completely intact and preserved with all the niches where the bodies go and where the bones go. Very, very, very cool. Underneath Saint Etienne. The École Biblique had various archaeologists, fathers, monks who were also archaeologists. Père Vincent, Père Louis Vincent, very important archaeologist who worked in Ir David. Roland Deveau later on worked in Qumran, the site where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. Franciscans, other important Catholics around in the land of Israel. Already by the 13th century, they designate themselves as Custodia Terra Sancta, the custodians of the Holy Land, the custodians of the holy sites, but they're also fascinated by history and archaeology, and they discover many things. And today you can go to their museum that they built on the Via Dolorosa, which has all kinds of interesting artifacts. Okay, and we're going to end up with two frauds and a very important archaeologist. Wilhelm Moses Shapira, our only Jew so far. But he's a Jew who converts to Christianity, comes to the land of Israel, and becomes an antiquities dealer. He works with an antiquities dealer as an archaeologist. He's not really an archaeologist. Some of his antiquities are real. Some of his antiquities are fake. He fakes them himself together with the antiquities dealer. And this carries on for a long time, and they do a pretty good business, a good enough business that he's actually able to buy this beautiful house, which today we call Beit Ticho, because the Tichos bought it afterwards, but first it was bought by Wilhelm Moses Shapira. He does very nicely for himself, and then he either overreaches or in some fascinating new research, he discovers a Dead Sea Scroll, but he doesn't know that that's what it is. He finds he sells these ancient scrolls. As you can see, they're written in the old Hebrew script in the Ktav Ivri. He says this is a text that was written by Moshe Rabbeinu. Clearly, it wasn't written by Moshe Rabbeinu. He is unmasked as a fraud, and he is so disturbed by this that he actually goes to Rotterdam and he commits suicide. Today, there's fascinating research suggesting that, okay, maybe it wasn't of Moshe Rabbeinu, but perhaps he found a Dead Sea Scroll, which nobody knew about, obviously, in the 19th century. So that's just a very interesting story. Montague Parker, we don't have so much time for his story. Maybe we'll do it next time. An adventure hunter comes based on the advice of a Finnish mystic on a treasure hunt to find Solomon's treasures underneath the Dome of the Rock, gets run out of town by the Ottoman Turks, but interesting guy. But we have to finish with Petrie because he is so important. He's really the founder of the modern science of archaeology. He's an Egyptologist. He excavates in Egypt, then he moves to Palestine, to the land of Israel, and he lives out his life here. His wife, Hilda, she's the one in the middle here, also his assistant, very intrepid, certainly for a 19th century woman, goes with him everywhere, is one part of the story of discovering the earliest alphabet. Petrie's contribution to archaeology, there are many contributions, but one of the greatest is he comes up with two very important ideas. One is called stratigraphy, right? Which you'll say is obvious, but it wasn't obvious till he figured it out, that things go in layers, right? And the stuff on the bottom is old and the stuff on the top is new, right? And he's the one who figured that out. He also came up with the idea, he wasn't a treasure hunter, he was very methodological. And he said pottery looks different in different eras, right? my Corel from the 1980s looks different from your China from the 1930s. And if you can find enough pottery from enough layers, you can have a dictionary of pottery, and then you can understand you can help date things. And today that's like a building blocks, an ABC of archaeology. But probably his most famous discovery is something called the Merneptah Stela, which he discovered in the city of Luxor in Egypt in 1896. This is a monumental Egyptian inscription from the 1200s BCE. It is the first time that the name Israel depicted as a nation. You can see all these people here, right? It's the first time it appears outside of the Torah. Okay, of course, the very first time it appears, we are already gone. Israel is laid waste. His seed is no more. Okay? When it was discovered, when they figured out the hieroglyphics that this actually spells out Israel, his comment was, "Won't the reverends be pleased?" Right? It's the first time that we have a non-biblical reference to the people of Israel. So it's a very, very exciting thing. This is his grave in the Protestant cemetery on Har Zion, with the Egyptian symbol of an ankh, the symbol for life, right? And that's Flinders Petrie. Okay, let's see. We have a few questions. Let's see if we can answer them all in 10 seconds or less. Okay, let's go back to the beginning. The Chanukiah, right? I'm going to find it. The King James Bible, I just wanted to put in the Bible, right? Bible, because the Bible was part of the story and this fascination with the Bible, with religion, with the second coming, so many other things. Robinson's teacher was a Hebraist, Moses Stewart. Oh, so interesting. Very, very cool. Okay, thank you. Very interesting. Okay, what else we got here? I'm not going to read the whole geology. I'm sorry, but it does sound very interesting. The mashpir of today, yes, is in Kikar Tzion. We can do a shopping trip. The city of David had some houses, but it was much less built up than today. He's using a kayak, not a canoe. All right, I'm sorry. I'm not good enough to know the difference between them. Hanan Tigay wrote a book about Rob Roy, about James McGregor. Okay, cool. I did not know that.
About Shapira.
About Shapira. Yeah, there's a few interesting books about Shapira. He's very interesting. And if you like this story, actually on Torah in Motion's podcast, oh no, it's the guy from Torah in Motion's podcast. He appears on a different podcast talking about Christian David Ginsburg, who's the guy who supposedly unmasked Shapiro as a fraud. Okay, so a lot of interesting stuff there. Okay. Yes, I'm listening.
I can't remember the name of the book. Something about the lost something of the Bible or something like that. If you look up Hanan Tigay, you'll find the book.
Oh, interesting. I'm trying to see if I can show you my Chanukiah. Let's see. Can I do
Shulie,
that?
just before that, המקום
Yes.
ינחם אתכם עם שאר אבלי ציון וירושלים.
Amen. Thank you very much. Okay. I'm just going to share my screen for anybody who's interested in seeing this Chanukiat HaKravot. How am I going to do that? Share my screen. Here we go. Okay. That is the Chanukiat HaKravot of Jabo. Okay. Where you have the various battles, 1, 2, 3, 4, all of them victorious, then Tihor HaMikdash, and then a defeat, a victory, a defeat. Okay, nice. Yofi, thank you everybody. Shabbat Shalom. It's nice to see all of you back again, and we will reconvene next week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shulie.
Shabbat Shalom. Remember to say
Shabbat
Ten
Shalom.
Livracha.
We've been saying it for quite some time, but thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shulie.
Thank you,
Thank
Shulie.
you.
Wonderful to see you.
Thank you.
Surely you should only have smachot.
Amen, amen. Thank you very much.
All right, only simchas.